Hello and welcome back to Cloud with Chris. You're with me, Chris Reddington, and we'll be talking about all things cloud. We're going to go into a little bit of a different direction for this episode and focus on the podcast itself and my podcast journey so far. As you'll know, I'm still early on in this journey, so I do appreciate all of your support, whether that is feedback to keep making the episodes more useful, liking or subscribing across social media or podcast channels, or suggesting topic ideas for future episodes. All of these can be found on the podcast's website, www.cloudwithchris.com. Not only is this episode topic slightly different, we're running a different format as well. In this episode, I'm joined by my colleague, Fletcher Kelly, who is exploring the idea of setting up his own podcast. Instead of me being the interviewer, I'm the one who ends up in the hot seat and talk about my experience so far of setting up Cloud with Chris. Hopefully this will give you a little bit of an idea of my journey so far and why I wanted to set the podcast up as well. So let's go ahead and start the episode. Hi everyone and welcome back to our current episode of Cloud with Chris. Now we're taking a little bit of a different direction with this one. I'm actually joined today by yet another guest. I've told you in previous episodes that we've got plenty of guests lined up. We've got plenty of people coming in, and I'm very delighted to be joined by Fletcher Kelly today. And one of the things that Fletcher and I have had a few discussions about in the past is actually getting started on this journey of making a podcast. So I know it's Cloud with Chris, but we're going to be going in a slightly different direction for this one and talking about the actual process of me getting this podcast set up and some of the things that I've been thinking about and some of those steps I've taken along the way. So, Fletcher, how are you doing, sir?
Good, thanks in yourself, Chris. Really good to be on the show and looking forward to getting some of the questions I've always wanted to ask answered, but always been too afraid to ask. So let's see what happens.
Excellent. Yes, let's see what happens indeed. I think, this one's, it's going to be a slightly different, as I say, compared to some of the others. It's not necessarily cloud. There will be sprinklings of cloud throughout because of the way I've actually approached how I've done my podcast. But yeah, I guess I have the easy job in this session. I'm actually taking the back seat while you ask some of your questions and maybe put me in the hot seat for a change. So it's going to be a different experience for me as well. So this is where I hand over my reign and go and let you take over, Fletcher. So what's top of mind? Where are you on that journey for everyone listening in right now?
So, top of mind for me right now is I'm basically trying to figure out the best use for a podcast for me specifically. And I sort of like what you're doing with yours, and that's why I want to have a chat to you. Uh, from my understanding, is you're using it as a way to share your knowledge, and that's exactly what I'm trying to do as well. So if you've got any learnings or anything that I could maybe take away from that, because every day
Hmm.
we do something interesting, we have customers that challenge us, and you spend some time figuring it out, and inevitably a year later you go, I remember having this problem. I have no idea how I fixed it, but I have fixed it before. I want to start using a podcast and maybe in combination with a blogging type platform to actually be a
Sure.
knowledge repository so that I can find a way to leverage the podcast so that I can move past that issue in the future. What sort of hints and tips would you have for that, and how have you gone about doing that?
Wow, what a great question there. You're really making me think to start off with. Maybe if I talk a bit about my journey. So I've tried the whole blogging thing in the past, and I've still got my own website. There is a blog on there as well. But if you look at it, you'll probably see it a little bit neglected. It's got content from a couple of years back and nothing really since. And I think one of the things for me was just finding the time to sit down, write that all up, and keep regularly posting it. And you can say the exact same thing about a podcast as well, because you absolutely need to do all of that. And I'm sure we'll cover a bit of that as we go through this kind of discussion here as well. But really, for me, I know that for the past few years, I've been focusing on Azure, I've been focusing on cloud, and there are still certain things that for me keep springing up. And that was the thing for me that made me realize actually, you know what? I actually probably have something valuable to say here. So I think one of the things when I was doing a bit of research about getting started with the podcast, how you go and start all of these things off, was thinking about what that main topic is that you want to talk about and having that real relatable thing that you can discuss. So for me, that's cloud. One of the other things I did consider doing, another passion area of mine, is theatre and musicals and that sort of topic. And it's still something I'm wondering, do I start maybe a separate podcast about? But then I need to think about the hours in the day and all of these kinds of things. But really, what you want to think about first is what is that topic going to be? Because whilst there's plenty of podcasts out there, there's not as many podcasts as there are blogs. And I think we've gone through that evolution with blogs where there's just so many blogs out there. How do I know which one that I go and look at? And if you've got a following, you probably have this. There's certain people out there, for example, like Scott Hanselman and others who blog regularly and have a really good following. So if you've got that, you've got your name out there, brilliant, great. Whereas if you don't, getting started in the blogging space these days is probably a little harder. And there aren't as many podcasts as there are blogs. So if you're trying to get a way of getting your content out there, it's probably not a bad way to go. But it does mean that you have to be comfortable with talking, with doing the prep, potentially interviewing people and working with other people there as well. It's not just about solving your own problems, writing the content. There are two different approaches of delivering that content out there. So that's probably one of the main things I would say is figuring out first that topic. Because then what that does is that gives you the title of your podcast and whatever that would be and what you get to there, really, then in terms of the end result. And it took a bit of time to get to where I am now. I had some encouragement from one of my previous guests, Abel Wang, when I was back in Redmond a few months ago. He and I were chatting, and this was an idea at the time. And he really gave me the push and the encouragement and said, why not? What have you got to lose? Try it out, see what happens. And here we are. It took a lot of discussion with other people, convincing should I buy the microphone? Should I go and start this podcast? What should it be called? And it was really a journey. And I'm still going on it. So I'm by no means finished, but that's at least some of the things top of mind when I think about the past couple of months and getting started there. I know it's a bit of a roundabout answer, but hopefully there's something in there that triggers something in your mind there, Fletcher.
That's great. For me, I think the resonating point is absolutely picking a theme and then finding something to be not opinionated about, but definitely be passionate about, I think really does help.
Hmm.
You did mention something really interesting, and you said you come from a theatre background. So I'm curious if that has helped here. So the one thing that is sort of putting me off a little bit, if I can call it that, is being able to listen to yourself. So when you speak, you sound one way. And then obviously when that gets played back to you, you go, who is that stranger talking back to me? Because what we hear is very different to what we sound like. How have you worked around that?
Mm.
Does it still bug you?
Interesting question. A really interesting question. So let me tackle the first part of what you said first around the theatre side of things. I've done the whole theatre side of things for a few years now. Started back way back in high school and started it again over the last couple of years. So whilst it's helped, I'd say there's elements of what we do in our day to day that probably help equally as much as well. I think one of the first things is being willing enough to put yourself out there. The whole idea of listening to yourself back is something I'll come back to in a minute. But I think the main thing, firstly, is putting yourself out there. Actually, one of the things when I started this podcast and I released my teaser, before I started doing the first episode, I remember waking up this one night and just thinking, "What on earth have you done? Why are you starting doing this? Why are you putting yourself out there like this?" It's actually quite scary. When you think of it as an idea, it's like, oh yeah, this is fine. But when you actually do it, then you think, oh wow, I've got to keep up this rigor of submitting so many episodes over however period of time and releasing all of this content. But actually, now that I'm 5, 6 episodes in by the time we're actually recording this one, it's actually a lot of fun. It's actually something that I really enjoy. And coming back to that point about listening to yourself back. I remember in the first episode, I was very, very, very picky about how I edited the content. And like, if there was a breath here, if there was an there, if there was just a pause or something that I didn't quite like, I'd be very picky. Now, in reality, all of that takes time to edit post production. And that's something where I don't necessarily have the luxury of having all of that time. Now, one of the things that I do as well for this particular podcast is I transcribe everything that's said just to make it a bit more accessible. So, what you're going to have to think about is what piece are you willing to compromise on? Because, like anything, there's not enough hours in the day to do everything. And that would be one of the things that I would say. Now, coming back to the main point about hearing yourself back, I don't have as much of a problem with it anymore, actually. And I don't know if it's because we are now a few episodes in, I've gotten used to it. But what I would say, and this is one of the tips that I've seen on a load of different podcast blogs and recommendation sites out there, is when you record an episode, have something that for the next episode you want to improve upon. So try and always be constructive and try and always keep improving. Don't look at the negatives, but look at what you can keep doing better. Spin it into a positive. So for me, I know when I'm doing these, there's actually certain key phrases that I keep saying. I try to steer away from those, and actually, it probably makes it better for the day to day job as well during calls that we have with customers, those kinds of things. That's one of the things that I would say is actually listening to yourself back does seem to get easier. A few years ago as well, I presented at this event that we ran in the UK in a previous role called Dev Briefing, and we had a guy come in to do a bit of coaching with us from a presentation style perspective. And one of the things I remember him very clearly saying was never, ever, ever listen to yourself back and watch yourself back at the same time. Do one, do the other, but not both. Because if you do both at the same time, it's just too overwhelming to your system. And it's just, you start cringing at it. So I think because I've only got the one, it's okay. If I started going down the streaming route and had both, maybe we'd have a different discussion. And that's something that I'm still thinking about. But I think it's gotten easier the more that I've done these, is probably the answer I'd say.
Okay, so now to bring it back to a bit of cloud, because that's the whole point around this, you mentioned that you transcribe everything. So here's a question.
Mm.
Are you doing this manually or are we actually using some tools? Because we work for a
Hmm.
really cool company and we've got stuff like Stream. Does that
Mm.
work or is that only for video?
Yeah, good question. So I haven't tried Stream yet, actually. But what I actually do at the moment is I record the episodes. I record the episodes using Zencaster. That's what we're using right now. And what I do then is I take the audio, merge those into a single track, and use one of the Microsoft Cognitive Services APIs. So I use the speech to text API. And what I do is I log on there, upload the latest recording. I then run a test over it, and then it generates a load of or transcribed, I should say, information from the recording into a text file. But the thing that I would say there is it's literally raw text. There's no capitalization, there's no punctuation, there's none of that in there. So what I then do is I listen back to the episode, and as I'm doing some of the post production, I update the text alongside. But there are a few cognitive services APIs that I haven't tried yet. For example, the video indexer API and the batch transcription APIs. So I'll need to experiment with them and see which one suits my use case best. I'm sure there's ways I can optimize it. Stream is a really good suggestion, actually, one I should probably try out. But I know there's other external services out there that do this type of thing. So still learning, still growing in that space, but that's the current approach, at least, that I use.
So then I guess that brings me to another question. Is that's obviously part of your workflow. How much of your time actually goes into post-production? Because I see we're a couple minutes in, and Zencast is quite nice because I can at least see how far in we are and how nervous I should be getting. So far so good. But how much time do you actually invest post-production? Is it double the
Hmm.
time, triple the time, half the time? Is there like a sort of formula? Because, like you were saying, obviously, as you get into it, becomes more and more of a hobby, but we all
Hmm.
live busy lives. So I'm very curious, and
Absolutely.
maybe do this in 6 months from now and see how you've changed your workflow, because that's the one big thing for me is we work long days, we have family, we have friends. I don't, I'm amazed you actually get to fit this in. That's very impressive.
Well, I think number one is it's definitely a bit easier in the current scenario, given everything that's going on in the world with
Yes.
COVID-19. I suddenly have a lot of time on my hands.
See the good and the bad.
Exactly, yeah, so we'll spin it into a positive. But it's a really brilliant point, and I'd absolutely love to do this again in, say, 6, 8 months or whatever, because I'm sure there'll be plenty that will have changed since we're recording this now, and it would be a really interesting exercise to do that again. What I would say then is I don't think there's a formula right now just because I'm still so much in the early days. It's a little bit like that DevOps idea, or agile idea of the cone of uncertainty. What that is for anyone listening who doesn't know what that means. The more you iterate over something, the more you do that, and the more you predict how long something's going to take, the more accurate your predictions get, the more you do those predictions. So as you go on the first sprint, the first time you estimate that, your estimations are way off. You're completely wrong. Second time, you might be a bit better. Third time, you might have got a bit worse again. But as you go on and on and on, you start getting better at those predictions. And that's what I find with this actually. The first time that I recorded an episode, like I mentioned, I was so focused on all the little breaths here, the ums, the too long of a pause, all of those little details. My understanding of the software that I use, so I use Audacity to do the post production. My understanding of Audacity at the time wasn't as much as it is right now. So all those little command shortcuts, all of those little tips and tricks to make things sound better, I don't have to go and research each time now. I'm just doing those by hand and by knowledge and by memory. So all of those things are quicker. So for the episode I recorded recently, the API economy one, I think the total recording length was about 30 minutes roughly. And I did a little pre statement, little post statement, like I do with all the episodes. So that's a couple of minutes each side. I probably spent a few hours on the post production, and that's the editing of it, that's the transcribing, that's the getting all of the information from the different guests and putting that onto the website. Because there's certain things in there that I've also automated to make things a bit easier. You know, coming from my DevOps background, of course, I'm going to try and automate some of that and save myself some time along the way. But ultimately, I think the main amount of time is the post production and the transcribing, and those are two areas I definitely know that I can bring down. Even tools like Zencaster have some post production capabilities built in some of the higher tiers. And similarly, like we've said on the transcribing side, there's probably other services that I can go and look at that might be able to help there. So it's really balancing that whole time versus cost thing, coming back into requirements of all things there. So that's probably the answer I'd give you there, Fletcher.
Okay, so obviously got a website, and I would definitely like to have a longer discussion around that. So maybe we can do that another episode, especially with the CI/CD and, like you were saying,
Mm,
automate a lot of the potential uploads of the audio files and maybe
hmm
do some type of quality checking. Maybe
mm,
use something like Markdown, so that's a little bit easier to actually do the pages. But
sure.
we know for a fact that in the team, you often get mocked around one specific thing when you switch on your video, and you use it all, and you know where this is going.
I know
So
where this is going.
here's the $1 million question, and I hope it didn't cost that, but that particular investment that you made into the microphone, would you have
Mm.
done it any differently? Like for someone like me that's looking at starting out, would you have gone cheaper, more expensive? Are you happy? Do you understand? What sort of guidance would you give with that?
Sure, sure, absolutely. And I think brilliant question because I'm going through the same process in my mind at the minute because I'm thinking of not just doing podcasting, but doing streaming as well. So with streaming, there's of course the same question, but with a webcam. So I'm doing the exact same kind of thought process, but for streaming instead. I think what it comes down to is how serious are you about starting that? Is it just something that you want to try out, experiment, and see if it works? Or is it something where you're fully dedicated, you're fully behind the idea, and you think, right, this is definitely going to happen. This is definitely what I'm going to do. So for me, I knew that the podcast thing was definitely going to happen. My track record of blogs, maybe
Yeah, yeah.
maybe I should have been a bit more cautious, but actually, the podcast thing definitely was going to happen. So for me, I've got a Blue Yeti USB microphone. I bought it whilst I was traveling, so I think it cost me like around $100 or maybe $120, something like that, and was cheaper than what it was back here. For me, it was just a no-brainer. I'm going to invest in it. That looks like a decent microphone actually for the price, and in terms of the sound that I get back and some of the functionality it gives me, that looks great. But if I wasn't as committed to the idea and I wasn't as sure, I can understand why people maybe would go for some alternate microphones, for example. So I think the important thing is setting yourself a budget, because there's so many different options out there, of course. Set yourself a budget, figure out how much you really want to go and spend, and then just start researching. And that's exactly what I did. So there's plenty of websites out there about setting up your first podcast, how you look at different microphones, even podcasts about setting up your first podcast, and streams about setting up your first podcast. So that is what I would recommend, is do that bit of research up front. I started off by buying the Blue Yeti USB mic, and it's absolutely perfect. The version that I bought, though, it has like it stands on its own. So rather than having one of the boom arm stands that I've got right now, which I invested in a bit later, it didn't come with that. And it's just thinking about that whole setup and how you want that to go and look. So for me, one of the things that I read, for example, and I know this because I'm a singer, I know about posture and the importance of that with voice and all these things, is if you're leaning over to speak into a microphone, it makes your voice sound different. So that's the reason why I have this arm stand that I've got here for the microphone, because I can sit up well, I can have a good posture, and it means that my voice will sound natural. It won't sound strained or pulled in some way. So thinking about that setup, and even not just the microphone, but the accessories that come with that as well, is important. And what I would say, just bringing it back full circle, I mentioned that I'm looking into cameras and webcams and for streaming. I'm really struggling on that one actually, because I don't know how much I want to go and put into that, because I don't know how serious I am about that one. This is a new exercise, a new idea, a new thought. So I've been looking at like Logitech webcams, and at the minute there are none anywhere again because of COVID-19, and demand from working from
Yes.
home has meant everything's disappeared. But I've seen people who have mirrorless digital SLRs, for example, and use those for streaming. Fair
Wow.
play, the quality looks immense, the quality looks amazing. And I have an SLR. It's probably about 10 plus years old, maybe 15 years old. But I don't know if I could justify that amount of money into it right now. So I think it's one of those things. If you're testing the waters, maybe start lower and invest bigger as you get more committed to the idea. And that's kind of what I'm thinking with the streaming side of things. So starting with something like a Logitech webcam, and then going a bit bigger later if I decide to really commit to that idea.
Well, on that point, I've got one of the Logitech webcams, and it seems pretty decent. It's not a high-end, top-of-the-range one. It does do the job. But that's actually quite a nice segue, sort of, into another topic. The one thing that I'm a little bit concerned about in terms of a podcast is it's a limited media. And what I mean by that is people can't see you, they can't see your expressions. And this happens to me all the time. For example, when I'm trying to have this deep networking discussion with the customer, you inevitably end up going, okay, I need to whiteboard this, I need to see it. So, what I was thinking about doing is potentially supplementing a podcast with like screen recording software or something like that. So, if you're talking about, to your point a little bit earlier, DevOps with your website. You can talk about it and you can understand it, but if you tell me, okay, I'm going to look at a release pipeline and then I'm going to have this piece of script running and that piece of script running, hearing it, you go, yes, yes, that's great. I fully understand. But then when I want to go do it, I'm like, wait a minute, when Chris was speaking about it, it made perfect sense. Now when I'm doing it, where's that button? Where did he click? What was he talking about? So that's something I was thinking about doing. And maybe before you go and take the plunge to buying a webcam, you could maybe do that, record something where it's not you physically, but you're talking and recording something and see how that works for you, maybe.
That's a great suggestion. There's actually something quite subtle that you also hinted at in there as well, which I really want to pull out. And it's the reason why I transcribe the episodes, actually. And that is accessibility.
Mm,
One of the things, of course, with podcasts is if you're hard of hearing, then this is not an accessible format for you. So having something like a streaming service or a streaming approach is actually quite inclusive, because you have the video content, you can see the facial expressions and whatnot as well, but you could have subtitles over the top of that. So I completely agree with you. I think there's a nice stepping stone approach between the two. And that's maybe something I could experiment with, embedding when we get into those more practical sessions, maybe some screen grabs or GIFs or those kind of things into some of the transcriptions as well. It's a nice idea. Certainly a nice idea. Awesome. So, Fletcher, I think we've had some really good discussion there about some of my initial thoughts around how I got started with Cloud with Chris. Now, I know we said it's a cloud focused podcast and we might hit cloud at some point, maybe not so much in this one. I guess we mentioned cognitive services at one point, but I think certainly in the future we can have another discussion, maybe a part 2, taking a look at how I've approached, for example, some of the website side of things and actually getting set up on some of the channels and whatnot as well, that I can go and publish this podcast through. So would definitely love to chat further with you again, Fletcher, on this, and invite you back to talk more. So Fletcher, thank you so much for coming on and putting me in the hot seat for a change. It's certainly a different experience for me, so thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
There we go. Something a little different to listen into on Cloud with Chris for this episode. If you'd like to hear a little bit more of what goes on behind the scenes, or about the journey that I'm on setting the podcast up, please let me know, as we can run more episodes like this in the future. I already have plans to dive a little bit deeper into the technical side of how I got things going with Cloud with Chris. These range from how I host the website and the podcast audio, all the way through to my development process for the website itself, and talking through how I integrate external services like Calendly and Office Forms into my workflow. Like many these days, time is a valuable asset. I look for opportunities to continue optimizing and potentially automating some of these tasks to make my time on Cloud with Chris more effective. So those will be some additional topics to look forward to in the future. In the meantime, I hope that you're keeping safe and well, and thank you once again for tuning in. Until next time, goodbye.